Margaret Lewis never expected betrayal to arrive in something as ordinary as a text message. It was a damp Thursday morning in late November in Portland, Oregon. Rain pressed softly against the kitchen windows of the craftsman house she had shared with her late husband for nearly 4 decades. The kettle had just begun to whistle when her phone vibrated against the granite countertop. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and glanced at the screen, assuming it was a reminder from the pharmacy or a note from her book club. It was her daughter, Claire. The message was brief and startlingly blunt. "Don't plan anything for Thanksgiving. We're spending it with Mark's family. They actually need us." Margaret read it twice, then a third time. The phrase "actually need us" seemed to pulse against the glass screen. The kettle shrieked louder, but she did not move to silence it. Something inside her chest tightened in a way that felt both physical and emotional, like a door closing quietly but permanently. She was 71 years old, a widow for 4 years. The house felt larger since Thomas passed, its rooms echoing with routines instead of conversation. For most of her life, holidays had meant noise, flour dust in the air, too many chairs pulled up to the dining table. Even after Claire married, even after she moved across town, she had always come home for Thanksgiving. Sometimes rushed, sometimes distracted, but present. Margaret set the phone face down and turned off the stove. The kitchen seemed unusually silent. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past, splashing through shallow puddles. Life carried on, indifferent to the quiet fracture that had just formed. Before that morning, Margaret had built her world around a simple conviction. If you gave your child everything you had, love would circle back to you. She and Thomas had not been wealthy. He managed a small printing company near the riverfront. She worked as a receptionist at a dental clinic downtown. They budgeted carefully, rarely traveled, drove practical cars long after their neighbors upgraded. Every extra dollar went into savings for Claire. When Claire was born, Thomas had opened a college fund within weeks. Margaret still remembered balancing checkbooks at the kitchen table long after midnight, determined to carve out security for their daughter. Vacations were postponed. Home renovations delayed. They told each other they were investing in something greater than comfort. Claire grew up secure and adored. Margaret volunteered at every school fundraiser, attended choir concerts, stayed up through teenage heartbreaks and exam anxiety. Thomas taught Claire to ride a bicycle in the park, jogging alongside her until his breath came short. They were present parents, intentional parents. When Claire left for university in Seattle, Margaret cried for days, but masked it as pride. Tuition was partially covered by scholarships, but the rest came from the savings account built over 18 years. Neither parent complained. Claire's future felt like the most important project of their lives. After graduation, Claire struggled to find stable work. The job market was competitive, and she moved back home for nearly a year. Margaret welcomed her, without hesitation. Groceries were purchased without comment. Utility bills rose quietly. When Claire found a marketing position and moved into her own apartment, Margaret and Thomas gifted her money for the security deposit and first month's rent. Then Thomas died suddenly from a stroke one winter morning. The loss hollowed the house in a way Margaret could not fully describe. Claire stepped in during the first months, visiting often, calling nightly. Margaret clung to those conversations like lifelines. When Claire met Mark, a charismatic financial consultant with confident manners and polished shoes, Margaret was relieved. He seemed stable, ambitious. The wedding was tasteful and expensive, more elaborate than Margaret would have chosen, but she contributed generously without complaint. It felt important to support her daughter's new beginning. Over time, subtle shifts occurred. Claire's calls became shorter. Visits required scheduling weeks in advance. Mark often spoke for her, finishing sentences, redirecting conversations. Margaret noticed but dismissed the discomfort as generational difference. The first request for financial help after the marriage came 2 years later. Claire explained that Mark's investment venture had hit an unexpected delay. Funds were tied up temporarily. They needed a short-term loan to bridge expenses. Margaret transferred $5,000 the same afternoon. More requests followed over the next 18 months. A condo renovation that exceeded budget. A medical deductible not fully covered by insurance. An opportunity to buy into a promising startup that required immediate capital. Each explanation arrived wrapped in urgency and reassurance. It's temporary. We'll repay you soon. You know we would do the same for you. Margaret never asked for documentation. She never insisted on repayment schedules. Trust felt more important than paperwork. Still, she began recording amounts in a small leather planner she kept in her bedside drawer. Not because she suspected deception, but because the totals unsettled her. 10,000 became 20. 20 became nearly $60,000 over 3 years. Thomas had once cautioned her gently about boundaries. Help, yes, he used to say, but never at the cost of your own security. Margaret remembered those words more often now. As autumn returned again, the financial requests slowed, replaced by emotional distance. Claire sounded distracted during calls. Mark rarely greeted Margaret directly anymore. Invitations to dinner became infrequent. Thanksgiving approached. Margaret bought fresh cranberries, polished the silverware, thawed the good china from storage. Despite the silence, she believed tradition would hold. Then came the message. Don't plan anything. They actually need us. The wording hurt more than the decision. It implied hierarchy, measurement, a scale in which she had been weighed and found unnecessary. That afternoon, Margaret sat at her desk and opened her laptop. She logged into her online banking for the first time in weeks. Several joint access accounts still listed Claire as an authorized user, accounts created years ago for convenience, for emergencies. She studied recent transactions more carefully than ever before. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then she noticed a series of transfers she did not remember initiating. Small withdrawals at irregular intervals. Then 2 larger transfers within the past month, each just under reporting thresholds. Her pulse quickened. Margaret cross-checked her checkbook register. No corresponding notes. No memory of authorization. She opened archived email confirmations. None were present for those transactions. A cold clarity settled over her. Without rushing, without panic, she contacted her bank's fraud department. She scheduled an in-person appointment the following morning. That night, she barely slept. At the bank, a young manager named Elise reviewed the accounts with grave professionalism. Access logs confirmed online transfers originating from Claire's IP address. Because Claire was an authorized user, the transactions were technically permissible. Technically. Margaret felt something inside her shift. Not anger. Not yet. But awakening. Elise explained options. Revoke access, create new accounts, require dual authorization for future withdrawals. Margaret signed every necessary form. She transferred the majority of her savings into newly established accounts under her sole name. She closed lines of credit Claire could potentially access. She updated passwords and security questions, choosing answers no one else would guess. Each signature felt like sealing a chapter. That evening, her phone rang repeatedly. She let it go to voicemail. When she finally listened, Claire's voice trembled with restrained frustration. "Mom, what did you do? Why can't we access the emergency account? Mark says this must be a banking error. Call us immediately." Margaret did not respond. The next morning, a car she recognized pulled sharply into her driveway. Claire stepped out first, her posture rigid. Mark followed, jaw set. Margaret watched from the living room window before opening the door. The confrontation unfolded quickly. Claire accused her of overreacting. Mark insisted they had implicit permission. Margaret remained composed, asking direct questions about the unapproved transfers. Neither provided clear answers. When Mark's tone sharpened, suggesting Margaret was jeopardizing their financial stability, something inside her hardened fully. "My stability matters too," she replied evenly. "And my consent." They left angrily, tires splashing rainwater as they reversed down the driveway. 2 days later, an unfamiliar number appeared on her caller ID. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Detective Alan Pierce from the Oregon Financial Crimes Division. He requested a meeting regarding an investigation involving Mark's consulting firm. Margaret felt the world tilt once more. She agreed to meet the following afternoon. At her dining table, Detective Pierce and a federal investigator explained that Mark was under scrutiny for misrepresenting assets during a pending civil case and potential bankruptcy filing. Financial disclosures had omitted substantial family contributions. Contributions traced to Margaret's accounts. If those funds remained accessible, the investigator explained carefully, they could have been implicated as concealed assets. Margaret understood instantly. The urgency. The withdrawals just below reporting thresholds. The insistence on restored access. They had not merely borrowed. They had prepared to use her savings as a shield. When the investigators left, Margaret sat alone for hours, staring at the rain-soaked yard. The betrayal was no longer emotional alone. It was legal, calculated. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Claire. "Please just talk to us. This doesn't have to become a disaster." Margaret set the phone down gently. For the first time in years, she did not feel small. She felt awake. By early December, the rain over Portland had turned colder, sharper, as if the sky itself had hardened. Margaret Lewis found herself moving through her days with unusual precision. She was no longer drifting between routines. She was observing them. Every sound, every message notification, every car slowing near her house felt amplified. The investigators contacted her again within a week. This time, they requested documentation, records of transfers, text messages discussing financial support, any written agreements. Margaret retrieved the leather planner from her bedside drawer and placed it carefully on the dining table. Page after page listed dates, amounts, short notes in tidy handwriting, condo repairs, deductible, bridge loan, investment gap. Detective Pierce flipped through it slowly. "This is very thorough," he said. "I wasn't trying to build a case," Margaret replied quietly. "I just needed to keep track." What she did not say was that somewhere deep inside, long before the bank visit, part of her had sensed imbalance. The investigators explained more this time. Mark's consulting firm was being examined for falsified asset disclosures tied to a bankruptcy protection filing. If it could be shown that he had access to significant undeclared funds, including regular infusions from a family member, the court would treat it as intentional concealment. Margaret absorbed the words carefully. Bankruptcy. Concealment. Federal review. Claire had never mentioned bankruptcy. When the investigators left, Margaret sat in silence, letting the truth rearrange her understanding of the past 3 years. The urgency in Claire's voice during those calls. The increasing sums. The defensiveness when asked about timelines. It had not been simple instability. It had been escalation. That evening, Claire called again. Margaret answered. There was no greeting. "Did you speak to anyone?" Claire asked immediately. "Yes." A pause. "You didn't have to do that." "They came to me." Claire exhaled sharply. "You don't understand how complicated this is." "Then explain it." Silence stretched. Margaret could hear faint movement in the background, perhaps Mark pacing. "It's temporary," Claire said finally. "There were accounting issues. Mark's lawyer is handling it." "Why didn't you tell me about the bankruptcy?" Another silence. Longer this time. "It wasn't finalized." That's not what I asked. Claire's voice tightened. We didn't want to worry you. Margaret almost laughed at the absurdity of it. You didn't want to worry me while transferring money from my accounts without asking? That was authorized access. Authorized does not mean invisible. The line went quiet. For a moment, Margaret thought Claire had hung up. Then she heard something she had not heard in years. Fear. If this investigation continues, Claire said slowly, it could ruin us. Margaret closed her eyes. Claire, if what you did was honest, the truth will protect you. And if it wasn't? The question hung between them like frost. Margaret did not answer. Claire ended the call first. 2 days later, Margaret received formal notice that she might be asked to provide testimony regarding financial transfers and her understanding of their purpose. Her attorney, a composed woman named Judith Harper, reviewed the paperwork carefully. You are not under investigation, Judith assured her, but your clarity will matter. Clarity, Margaret repeated. Yes. Intent, consent, awareness. Those will determine how the court interprets your involvement. Margaret thought about the word involvement. She had believed she was supporting her daughter. Instead, she had been positioned on the edge of legal jeopardy. Meanwhile, tension escalated outside official channels. One evening, as dusk settled early, Margaret noticed Mark's SUV parked across the street. It remained there for nearly 20 minutes. When she stepped onto her porch lighted by a motion sensor, the vehicle pulled away. The following afternoon, a package arrived at her door with no return address. Inside was a binder filled with printed financial summaries and highlighted numbers. A sticky note rested on top. You see? It's not what they think. Margaret did not open the binder fully. She placed it back in the box and called Judith. Do not engage directly, Judith advised. Let everything go through counsel. Margaret realized then that what frightened her most was not the investigation itself. It was the unraveling of who her daughter had become within it. As Christmas approached, decorations appeared throughout the neighborhood. Inflatable snowmen rose on lawns. Strings of lights blinked in rhythmic patterns. Margaret decorated minimally this year, a small wreath on the door, white lights along the mantel. Not out of sadness, but out of clarity. Celebration felt inappropriate in the midst of exposure. On December 18th, she received official notice of a preliminary hearing date set for mid-January. The charges under consideration included financial misrepresentation and fraudulent concealment of accessible assets. That same night, Claire appeared unannounced. This time, she came alone. Margaret opened the door cautiously. Claire's face looked thinner, her composure frayed. Can I come in? Margaret stepped aside. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Claire had once colored holiday cards. Claire spoke first. Mark says if you clarify that the transfers were gifts, unconditional gifts, it changes everything. Margaret folded her hands calmly. They were loans. We never signed anything. That does not redefine intent. Claire's eyes flashed. Why are you being so rigid? Because the truth matters. You're choosing the system over your family. Margaret felt a familiar sting, but it no longer pierced deeply. I am choosing honesty. Claire's voice cracked slightly. If Mark is charged, his license is gone. His firm collapses. We lose the condo. And whose responsibility is that? Claire did not answer. Instead, she shifted tactics. You said love means standing by your child. Margaret studied her daughter's face, searching for the girl who once scraped her knees in the driveway and cried into her shoulder. Love does not mean perjury, Margaret said softly. Claire's expression hardened. So that's it? You're willing to let this destroy us? Margaret inhaled slowly. Claire, I did not create this situation. I did not file false statements. I did not move money without permission. I will not lie to fix it. Claire stood abruptly, chair scraping against hardwood. You're unbelievable. Margaret did not rise.
No.
I am finally visible. Claire left without another word. The days that followed were eerily quiet. No calls. No messages. Margaret focused on small stabilizing habits. Morning walks through Laurelhurst Park, tea in the afternoons, volunteer shifts at the Community Literacy Center. The rhythm of ordinary life steadied her. Yet beneath that calm ran an undercurrent of anticipation. In early January, new developments emerged. Through her attorney, Margaret learned that Mark's business partner had agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for reduced liability. Internal emails suggested deliberate attempts to obscure available capital, including repeated references to family liquidity reserves. Margaret understood the implication. She had not merely been a passive source of funds. She had been categorized as a strategic asset. The phrase unsettled her more than the financial loss ever had. A week before the hearing, Judith visited Margaret's home to prepare her for possible testimony. "They may question your memory," Judith explained. "They may imply you knew more than you did." "I knew I was helping my daughter." That is enough. Margaret considered this carefully. Had there been moments she suspected deeper trouble? Perhaps. But suspicion without proof is not knowledge. On the eve of the hearing, Margaret stood alone in her living room, lights dimmed, rain tapping lightly against the windows once more. She felt neither anger nor triumph, only gravity. This was no longer about Thanksgiving messages or wounded pride. It was about the line between loyalty and complicity. She went to bed earlier than usual, setting her alarm with deliberate calm. In the darkness, one thought surfaced with startling clarity. Protection sometimes requires separation. And tomorrow, separation would become public. The courthouse in downtown Portland stood cold and symmetrical against a pale January sky. Margaret Lewis arrived early, accompanied by her attorney, Judith Harper. Frost clung to the sidewalks, and the air carried that sharp winter stillness that makes every footstep sound deliberate. Margaret wore a charcoal wool coat Thomas had once bought her for an anniversary dinner. It felt like quiet armor. Inside, the courtroom atmosphere was restrained, almost clinical.
No dramatic whispers. No visible spectacle.
Just paperwork, muted voices, and the low hum of institutional lighting. Claire sat several rows behind the defense table. Mark occupied the seat beside his attorney, shoulders squared but rigid. He did not look at Margaret when she entered. Claire did briefly, but her expression was unreadable. The hearing began with procedural clarity. The prosecution outlined discrepancies between declared assets during bankruptcy proceedings and documented financial inflows from family sources. The phrase undisclosed liquidity support appeared more than once. Margaret listened without flinching. Each figure corresponded to numbers she knew by heart. Mark's attorney argued that the transfers were informal family gifts with no expectation of repayment, therefore not qualifying as accessible business assets. The defense framed the situation as misunderstanding, not deception. Then the emails were introduced. Printed enlargements appeared on monitors, internal communications between Mark and his business partner. Phrases like "bridge through Margaret," "keep her outside formal disclosure," and "temporary shield until Q1 audit passes" surfaced. A quiet shift passed through the room. Margaret felt something inside her settle, not satisfaction, but confirmation. The ambiguity had evaporated. When called to speak, she rose carefully. Judith guided her through direct questioning first. "Mrs. Lewis, when you transferred funds to your daughter and her husband, what was your understanding of those transactions?" "That they were temporary loans to assist during financial strain." "Did you believe those funds were being disclosed in any legal financial proceedings?"
No.
"Did you authorize transfers made without your direct knowledge in October and November?"
No.
Her answers were steady,
Clear.
unembellished. During cross-examination, Mark's attorney attempted a softer strategy. Mrs. Lewis, you love your daughter. Yes. And you wanted to help her succeed. Yes. So it's possible you intended these funds as unconditional support? Margaret met his gaze calmly. I intended support, not concealment. A brief silence followed. Were you aware your daughter and her husband were considering bankruptcy?
No.
Had you known, would you have continued transferring funds? Margaret paused, not for effect, but for honesty. I would have asked questions. The judge watched her carefully. After testimony concluded, Margaret returned to her seat. Claire avoided eye contact. The hearing extended into the afternoon. By its close, the court determined sufficient evidence existed to proceed formally with charges of financial misrepresentation and asset concealment. Travel restrictions were imposed. Financial accounts directly connected to Mark's firm were frozen pending further review. No immediate sentencing occurred. This was not a dramatic climax, it was a transition. Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered, though the case was not high-profile enough for aggressive coverage. Still, cameras existed. Questions floated. Margaret exited through a side corridor as Judith recommended. In the car, neither woman spoke for several minutes. You did well, Judith said finally. Margaret nodded, staring at the winter-bare trees lining the street. I didn't do anything extraordinary. You told the truth. At home, the silence felt different than it had weeks earlier. Less ominous, more grounded. But the emotional reckoning had only begun. 2 days later, Claire appeared again. This time, she looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes, posture slumped. Margaret allowed her inside without hesitation. They sat across from one another in the living room. Mark says the emails were taken out of context, Claire began weakly. Margaret waited. He says Shield didn't mean what it sounds like. What did it mean? Claire's voice faltered. Temporary restructuring. Margaret did not challenge her. She had learned that confrontation alone does not produce clarity. Instead, she asked quietly, Claire, when did you know? Claire's composure cracked. Last summer, she whispered. Margaret felt the air shift. You knew about the bankruptcy filing? Claire nodded faintly. And you didn't tell me. Tears formed in Claire's eyes, but Margaret noticed something. They seemed driven more by pressure than remorse. He said it would pass. That it was procedural. That if we just stabilized for a few months, no one would be harmed. Except me. Claire looked down. I didn't think of it that way. Margaret's voice remained calm. That is the problem. Silence filled the room. I was scared, Claire admitted. We had invested everything into his firm. The condo, the lifestyle. I didn't want to lose it. And so you risked my security instead. Claire wiped her eyes. It wasn't supposed to hurt you. Margaret stood slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, a thin layer of snow had begun to fall. Impact matters more than intention, she said softly. Claire remained seated. Do you hate me? She asked. Margaret turned.
No.
Claire looked surprised. I don't hate you. I am disappointed. And I am careful. The distinction seemed to land heavily. Mark says if you retract parts of your statement. Margaret raised her hand gently. I will not. Claire exhaled sharply, frustration resurfacing. So that's it? You're choosing this outcome. Margaret's response was measured. I am choosing integrity. Claire left again, more slowly this time. In the weeks that followed, developments accelerated. Mark's business partner formally cooperated, providing accounting records that further demonstrated deliberate withholding of financial disclosures. Claire's role appeared secondary but complicit. A plea negotiation began. Margaret was not directly involved, but Judith kept her informed. Reduced charges were possible in exchange for admission and restitution agreements. One afternoon in February, Claire called unexpectedly.
It's happening, she said.
What is? He's accepting a plea. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. And you? I may have to testify. The words carried unfamiliar vulnerability. Margaret felt a complicated surge of emotion, sorrow, fatigue, reluctant empathy. Tell the truth, she said simply. There was a long pause. I don't know if that fixes anything. It fixes you. When the call ended, Margaret realized something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, Claire sounded less defensive, more uncertain. Consequences were no longer theoretical. As winter slowly loosened its hold, Margaret began reclaiming neglected spaces in her life. She resumed attending her weekly watercolor class. She met neighbors for coffee, without glancing at her phone. She rearranged the spare bedroom into a reading space with a soft lamp and shelves lined with novels she had postponed for years. The legal process continued, structured, procedural, inevitable. But Margaret no longer felt consumed by it. One evening, she found herself standing before the hallway mirror, studying her reflection. The woman staring back appeared older, yes, but steadier. She understood now that love had blinded her not out of weakness, but out of faith. Faith misplaced. The trial phase would conclude soon.
Sentencing discussion numd.
Claire's future remained uncertain. Yet Margaret felt something unexpected rising beneath the grief. Not relief, not triumph.
Clarity.
And clarity, she realized, was stronger than anger. By the time spring settled over Portland, the air felt different, lighter, almost cautious in its warmth. Cherry trees along the sidewalks began to bloom, their petals scattering across wet pavement like fragile confessions. Margaret Lewis noticed these things now. She noticed the way morning light reached deeper into her living room. She noticed birds returning to the maple tree outside her kitchen window. She noticed herself breathing more fully. The legal proceedings moved toward resolution, without spectacle. Mark accepted a plea agreement that included financial penalties, probation, and permanent damage to his professional license. His firm dissolved within weeks. Civil restitution would stretch over years, and much of it might never be fully recovered. Claire avoided more severe charges by cooperating early and providing documentation investigators had not yet uncovered. Her involvement was acknowledged but categorized as secondary. Margaret followed the updates through Judith, who summarized them with calm efficiency. There was no dramatic courtroom finale, no cinematic collapse. Just paperwork, signatures, and consequences recorded in ink. When the sentencing hearing concluded, Margaret chose not to attend. She had already said what she needed to say. She had already told the truth. Instead, she walked through Washington Park that morning, the scent of damp earth rising beneath her steps. Families passed with strollers. Joggers moved with steady rhythm. The world continued, uninterested in individual downfall. There was something strangely comforting in that. Claire called 2 days later. Her voice sounded different, stripped of urgency, stripped of argument. It's done, she said. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, a mug of chamomile tea warming her hands. Yes, she replied gently. There was no immediate follow-up. Just quiet breathing on both ends of the line. We're selling the condo, Claire said finally. We can't keep it. Margaret did not respond with sympathy or criticism. Only silence that allowed the words to exist. I moved into a smaller apartment, Claire continued. Just me. Margaret absorbed that carefully. And Mark? We're separating. The statement landed without shock. The fracture had been visible long before it was spoken aloud. I see, Margaret said. Another pause. I keep thinking about what you said, Claire admitted. About impact. Margaret traced the rim of her mug with her thumb. Understanding impact is painful, she said softly. But it's necessary. Claire's voice trembled slightly. I didn't realize how far things had gone. Every decision felt temporary. Every compromise felt small, until suddenly they weren't. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. "That's how erosion works," she replied. "It doesn't announce itself." Silence again, but this time it felt less hostile, less defensive. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Claire said. Margaret considered her response carefully. "Forgiveness isn't a switch," she said. "It's a process. But accountability is where it begins." Claire exhaled shakily. "I'm trying." "I know." When the call ended, Margaret did not feel healed, but she felt balanced. Over the following months, life reshaped itself into something steadier. Margaret deepened her volunteer work at the senior center. She began hosting small workshops teaching retirees how to monitor financial accounts, recognize manipulation tactics, and set protective boundaries. She spoke plainly, without dramatizing her own experience, but those who listened often recognized the subtext. Support should never require silence, she would tell them, and urgency is often the language of pressure. She also began meeting with a grief support group, something she had postponed after Thomas's death. There, she realized that part of her vulnerability had grown from loneliness left unaddressed. Helping Claire had filled an emotional void as much as a parental instinct. Recognition did not bring shame. It brought understanding. The house changed too. Margaret repainted the dining room a soft sage color. She donated furniture that carried heavy memories. She replaced the old front porch light with a brighter fixture, one that illuminated the walkway clearly at night. It was a small act, but symbolic. Summer approached gently. One afternoon, Claire asked to meet in person. They chose a neutral cafe near the river. Sunlight reflected off the water outside, casting shifting patterns across the windows. Claire looked thinner, quieter. There was no designer handbag this time. No polished performance. They ordered coffee. "I started therapy," Claire said after a few moments. Margaret nodded. "I'm trying to understand why I ignored so many warning signs." "That's important," Margaret said. "I think I was afraid of failing," Claire admitted. "Afraid of losing the life I thought I was supposed to have." Margaret listened without interruption. And when Mark said we just needed temporary support, it felt easier to agree than to question him. Questioning meant admitting something was wrong. Margaret's voice remained gentle. Denial can feel safer than conflict. Claire looked up. "Were you ever afraid? When you moved the money?" Margaret considered the memory of that morning, the quiet click of account closures, the tremor in her hands. "Yes," she said. "But I was more afraid of continuing without clarity." Claire absorbed that slowly. "I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were," she said. Margaret met her gaze steadily. "We won't," she replied. "But that doesn't mean we cannot build something different." There was no dramatic reconciliation.
No te felimbrás.
But there was honesty, fragile, tentative. They began meeting occasionally, not weekly, not with expectation, but intentionally. Conversations were careful at first, then gradually less guarded. Margaret maintained her boundaries firmly. No shared accounts. No financial entanglements. Support, if offered, came in forms that did not compromise her stability. Autumn returned once more. On Thanksgiving morning, Margaret woke early, as usual. She brewed coffee and stood by the window, watching golden leaves scatter across the yard. Her phone buzzed. A message from Claire. "Would you like to have dinner together this year? Just us. No pressure. If you're comfortable." Margaret read it once. Then she replied, "Yes. Let's cook together." The dinner was simple: roasted vegetables, a small turkey breast, cranberry sauce made from scratch. There were moments of awkward silence, moments of careful laughter. It was not the loud, crowded holiday of decades past, but it was real. As dishes soaked in warm water afterward, Claire paused beside her. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for everything." Margaret studied her daughter's face, not the child she once protected, not the stranger from the courtroom, but the flawed adult standing before her. "I know," Margaret replied. Forgiveness did not arrive like fireworks. It arrived like steady breathing, subtle, sustainable. That night, alone again in her quiet house, Margaret reflected on the year that had reshaped her. She had once believed love required endurance, without limit. That sacrifice proved devotion. That silence preserved family. Now, she understood differently. Love without respect corrodes trust. Generosity without boundaries invites exploitation. Silence protects dysfunction more than it protects relationships. Standing firm had cost her comfort. It had strained her bond with Claire. It had exposed painful truths. But it had preserved her integrity. And integrity, she realized, was not something to trade, not even for family. As winter approached once more, Margaret decorated her home deliberately. A modest tree by the window, warm white lights along the mantel, a single candle on the dining table, not as a symbol of waiting, but as a symbol of peace chosen. She no longer feared her phone vibrating in the quiet kitchen. She no longer felt responsible for solving crises that were not hers. She had learned that choosing yourself is not abandonment. It is alignment. And in that alignment, she had found something she once believed depended entirely on others: stability,
Clarity.
and a life that belonged fully to her again.